Hello and welcome back to lecture 22, where I'll be showing you a few materials about glass. Glass is a very interesting material because it has a very shiny property and it is actually translucent or refractive. So to get things going, we first need to have some interesting models. So as you can see, I have this interesting glass shape with some nice edges, which will give us a nice refraction and some nice actually diffraction in a bit more advanced glass material I will be showing you as well. So to get started, I have assigned a standard surface shader with just the basic material properties and currently nothing fancy. So the first thing what you want to do is make sure that you do not have any diffuse color, so no base at all, because a glass is completely transparent unless it has some dirt or some other paint on top of it. So for a typical glass, make sure your weight is on 0, or you just reduce the color to 0 as well. So what I always do, it's just a matter of habit, is just put this one to black and the weight to 0, so it's super clear that what's going on here. And then for the specular component, a glass is most of the time super shiny, so try a value of maybe 0.05 for the specularity, and you can see already by just adjusting the roughness we get a very interesting specular response. The IOR, index of refraction, is the amount of reflectivity. So when I slide it to a higher value, you can see it gets more and more like a metallic shader. We definitely don't want to do that, and beginners tend to do that quite often. They just increase the IOR because they want an object to be more shiny. But because Arnold is a physical render, we should try to make it happy and work in a physical scale. So you actually, if you click on the IOR, there are some presets for glass. So the glass has a few different types of glass. So it can range actually from 1.4 up to 1.6 almost. So depending on your needs or how you want to have it look, you can adjust it. I think 1.5 for this glass seems a bit too much. So I like to actually go down to 1.4, which reduces the overall reflectivity on the edges by a bit. So let's go with this. So for now, this would be all we got to do for the specularity and the base. And the next important thing is to set the transmission. And transmission means refraction. It's just a bit more fancier word. So whatever it means is the ray transmits, it goes into a surface. So for a typical glass, you would just put the weight on 1. And we are now almost actually done with the simpler glass shader. So the only thing which we need to do, which you can see looks a bit strange, is that it's super black at the bottom and the shadow is also very solid. So to fix this, on the shape of the object, under the Arnold tab, so if I head over to the surface and go to the shape and head over to the Arnold tab, you can actually see that the opaque switch is enabled, which means it's a very efficient render because Arnold already knows this object is not transparent if this text box is on. But because we render a glass, we need to turn this off to tell Arnold, hey, this is a glass surface. We need different properties for this. So let's just see what we get now. Let's just render and update the scene. And now you can see, just by updating the render, you can see now that the black spot at the bottom is totally gone and we are missing our shadow now. Because Arnold, or because of the shader is specified to be perfectly white, we can see that we are missing a shadow. So what you can actually do is just slightly reduce the color and you get the shadow back. A bit darker glass, but that is something you can work with because you get the nice shadow. One limitation of Arnold is because it is not a bidirectional path tracer, you cannot really calculate good looking caustics, but it has a little switch in the shader under the Advanced tab, which kind of adds some sort of caustics, but it's not super detailed or crisp, which you would get from a render like V-Ray or RenderMan. But you can see there is something happening at the bottom here. We can see some reflection. It's a bit more expensive in render times, but it does add to it. But just for now, I want to disable this. So what we did now was setting up a really simple, efficient glass shader. So let's get into detail about color, depth, and scatter. So we talked about the color and depth in the previous lecture. what each parameter actually does. So let's just work with that and see what we can get. So a typical glass is not 100% white. It has some color sheen to it. You can mostly see it if you look through the thick part of the glass. There is some color saturation going on. So that's something what we want to try to do here as well. So let's just say we want to have kind of like a little blue sheen to a glass. So if you don't use the depth, which is also something beginners mostly do, they just set the color to a color they want to render and say that's a complete done render, but it's actually not physically correct because the thick parts of the glass have the same color as the thin parts, and that is not accurate. So to compensate for that, you can still choose the color you want, but you should play around with the depth, which just means or tells Arnold, hey, this surface has a certain thickness, and when it hits that thickness, it should give you or return that color. So let's just try a depth of 10 and see what we get. And just by doing that, we can see that on the thinner parts, which is on the top of the glass, we can see it's almost see-through, and then the thicker the glass gets, the more rich and solid the glass looks in the end. And this is now, just by doing this, this looks a lot better than what we had before. I still think the saturation is a bit too much. So what we can do, we can head back to the color and just desaturate it by half maybe and see what we get. You can see now that it has still a slight blue tint to it, but other than that, it looks very realistic in my opinion. So we can also play around with the depth a bit more, maybe reduce it to 5, and then we get the solidness back if we want to have that. I think it's actually cool, it adds something cool to this glass. So maybe let's just leave it at a value of 5 and a really desaturated blue, which gives us a pretty cool looking glass. And then we also have scatter, and what scatter does, it adds some little particles into the glass. So if you have washed the glass in the dishwasher, you can see at some point it gets really chalky and white, and this is something you can mimic using the scatter. So if you bring up the scatter, you can see it gets really white and dirty, and this is something which adds a lot of realism to the glass. It looks now smoky or something like to a similar extent. Obviously this is now way too much, so let's just dial it in a little bit just to get rid of this clean, super clean white. So this is now a 5% gray, it's almost black actually, and it just added a little bit of smokiness to the thicker parts at the bottom, which I think helps tons in making a realistic looking. Also, another important thing about rendering with Arnold is the transmission depth. And on default, actually, the transmission rays are something around 4, I think. And you can see if it's that low, you can get these darker spots, especially on the edges and on thicker glasses, which have several layers. So let me just showcase what's actually happening. If I put this value to 1, you can see that the ray is not really going through the glass and it returns a black image. And this is because we are limiting Arnold to transmit further than one distance, than one ray depth. So if we put this to 2, the ray now has the ability to enter through the first layer of glass, go through the medium, and exit after the first layer. So this is what this does. And a value of 3 won't change as much. It will help us a bit in the bottom, but the ray is still not going through the whole surface. Only with a transmission depth of 4, you can actually see that the ray fully goes through the glass. So it's hitting the glass surface, going through the glass, exiting the surface, then it's traveling through air until it hits the back surface, enters that, and exit that. So this is what a transmission value of 4 does. You can still see we get these black spots. So what you can do to get rid of this is really take a high number, something like 10. Your render times go up by doing this, but your results are a lot more realistic. And I think on default, the total depth is on 10. So what it means is these numbers are added together to get the total. So if you want to make use of all these depths, what you can do is just put 12. And this is now the upper end of the ray depth, which we can use. So that's something to keep in mind. So one more thing I want to talk about is the dispersion ABI. And what it's doing, like this control enables Arnold to split the ray into its separate components, into its own wavelengths. And this happens actually in hard materials like diamonds, crystal, or glass. Glass is a kind of crystal because it's melted sand and it has some components to this. So when you have these hard edges, you get actually some bending of light and you get this kind of rainbow pattern. And if I would just enter a value of 5, you can already see that the glass is really tinted and it's not that crisp blue anymore, and you can see you get these nice rainbow effects. Obviously this is a bit too much for a typical glass. So the higher you put this number, like a value maybe of 100 is a high value, and then you almost get rid of this effect. And the smaller the value, the stronger this effect. And you can see on a value of 100, it is not that distinguishable anymore, but it's still definitely there. It's just not as apparent. And by having a value around this, which is, you can kind of register it, but it's not that visible, this is then exactly the right amount of dispersion. You have a few presets. For instance, a diamond has a value of 55, a measured value, and then sapphire, which is kind of like sand or like crystal, it is a higher value and is not that intense anymore. So if you have a sapphire glass, sure, do 72, but something around 100 for typical glass should be just fine. If it's still too much, it's artistic, you can play with it if you want. And now I actually think that my glass is too dark, so I like to push my depth back to 10 maybe, so we get a bit brighter glass. It's not as blue anymore, and we should see a nice rainbow effect. Also, by doing dispersion, you get also a nicer caustic pattern. So if I just render the bottom part and go back to my advanced tab in the shader and I enable caustics, you can see that we get now colored caustics. Obviously you can see it is very noisy now. So something to keep in mind. If you use this caustic checkbox, you would need to amp up your AA samples. So most of the time I tend not to use it just because of that, but it adds again realism to your shader or to your render. And the last and final aspect of glass is roughness. And what I'm talking about is smudges. If people touch it, they don't have clean hands, you leave fingerprints and it's dirty and smudgy. Currently, we have a super clean glass, which I would say does not exist in the real world because it's just too clean. The problem is, if you would go to the specular tab right now and you would plug in a map into the roughness, what it's actually doing, it is also changing the property of the transmission. So if I have a value of 0.2, maybe you can see that the glass is not see-through anymore because the roughness of the roughness of the transmission rays are blurred as well, like kind of like a sandblasted glass. So this is what you would get by changing the roughness to a 0.2, and you get like a nice looking sandblasted glass. If you want to do that, sure, do this using this technique. It looks pretty cool, like a icy glass, frosted glass. But we want to talk about smudges. So what I want to do now, instead of using the specular component, I will be using the coat instead. So I'm just disabling the specular for now. And you can see the transmission is still affected by the roughness. So if I put the roughness to 0, we get a super clean transmission. So we still want to have some roughness. 0.05 gives us some blurriness inside of the glass. It might actually be a bit too much. So let's go 0.025 and be happy with this. So instead of using the specular now, we get over to the code and we bring that back to 1. And then we change the IOR to 1.4 as well. And now we should have a similar glass, but we don't have the problem by changing the roughness to not make it not see-through anymore. So this is now something we can work with. So if I head over to the Hypershade and plug in a pattern like a noise pattern to the roughness, we should see something very interesting. All right, so now let's just create the noise shader, AI noise, and let's connect this, or let's just first create a range as well. I like to do that always, like noise into range into whatever I need it to. So let's just connect the red channel to the to the code roughness, and let's make the selection, disable that, and enable isolate selection and click on the noise. So this is what we get on the get-go with this noise pattern. I think it's already pretty good. The only thing is I like to invert those colors. So now, did that help? I don't really think it helps. So let's just bring up the detail. Something like this is maybe a bit too much already. So let's just work with levels of 2. I just wanted to get some broader areas which we can use for the roughness. So if I click on the range node now, I want to definitely only have the black spots be white to have kind of like a impression that it's actually fingerprints or some smudges. So let's do something like this, clamp those values. And then we just need to invert this. So let's just do output min to 1 and output max to 0, and the map is inverted. So we can still play around with those values. If you want to have a softer fall off or maybe more smudges, or we can go back to the noise and add more detail, maybe 5 or 4 octaves, see what we get now. We get more defined spots. So ideally what you would do is plug in a map, a texture, like there are several online websites where you can download textures. You can just Google for fingerprint texture or black and white or something, and just use that instead to get a more realistic effect for sure. So if I disable isolation, you can see now that on the glass here, we get something very interesting. It looks like it's not that clean anymore. There's something to this. Also, I still think the roughness overall is a bit too clean. So because we have a map connected, which is on 0 now, we can just say our output max has some little value of maybe a roughness of 0.02. Let's see what we get by this. You can see the reflection is a bit rougher. Let's go maybe up to 5. And we can see now it gets a bit more rough everywhere. And I think this helps quite a bit to just break up the roughness. It might be a bit too much, like it's too rough right there. So we can bring down the output min to just reduce the overall effect of this. And let's check isolation. If I bring it more down, you can see the white slowly disappears into this gray tone. So let's just render for the final render and see what we get. Alright, what I also did before rendering is I just enabled the caustic checkbox in the shader, and these were my final render settings. So I had to bring up the fuse component just to clear out the noise around the caustics, and you can actually see we get a nice looking kind of like a star-shaped pattern on the caustics. And this is a very cool effect, especially if the glass would be moving, if it would be an animation, you could definitely see it on the surface. So in this lecture, I showed you how to first create a very simple glass shader by just enabling transmission and making the weight to 1. And the next step was to just colorize the glass with a simple color. And then we were going into more advanced stuff by changing the depth, playing around with some scatter values. And for the final advanced method, we were just introducing dispersion, which breaks up the ray into its own wavelengths to get some nice coloration onto hard edges. And for the final step, we also added some roughness to this, just to make it a bit more plausible, to soften the reflections and to just make it more appealing. So I hope you liked this lecture about creating your own glass shaders, and I would be happy to see some renders from you guys. So please feel free to share your renders with me and I give you some nice feedback on this. So thank you for watching this lecture, and I will see you in the next one.